Dr. Robin Faith Walsh. I want to make sure I get the
I know,
middle name.
ironic.
It is, especially with what I discuss all the time. Are you still an associate professor at the University of Miami?
Yes, I am.
Awesome.
I just became associate. Yeah, I was assistant until 6 months ago, but now I'm an associate.
Excellent. Well, she earned her PhD at Brown University in Religions of the Ancient Mediterranean with a focus on early Christianity, ancient Judaism, and Roman archaeology. Before coming to the University of Miami, Professor Walsh taught at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. I believe it is, isn't it?
Yeah, there are two, but
Okay.
I was at the one in Mass. Yeah.
The College of the Holy Cross, and received teaching certificates and pedagogical, I can't even pronounce the term.
No, I can't.
Pedagogical, if I'm not mistaken, training at Brown University and Harvard University. She teaches courses on the New Testament, Greco-Roman literature, and material culture. I wish I could join some of the classes that she has on her website, robinfaithwalsh.com. And that's Robin with a Y. So you can go check out the website. It's down in the description. Her first monograph, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament Within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. The book is absolutely phenomenal. And I figure today we'll have the opportunity to listen to her do a shorter presentation, get right into some of this interesting stuff. You might be wrong about everything you think when it comes to New Testament studies. And that's what this book really did. So, Dr. Walsh, welcome to Myth Vision, and thank you for giving me your time.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to share some of my research and what I was trying to get at in this book. And I hope people find it interesting. And thank you for the support, too, for my research and for this topic.
Yeah, right. I'm thrilled. So I would be happy to hear what you have to say, and then we'll do Q&A.
All right, sounds great. So we're going to share screen.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And you can see?
I can.
Excellent. All right. So I can't see you, but try to, give me some kind of verbal cue if something starts to go awry, or if you have any questions, just jump in. That's completely fine with me.
Excellent.
So the book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature. One thing I like to do, because there's one thing to just kind of present your research, but it's another to actually talk to the person who wrote the thing and to get a little bit of the backstory. This image you see here, it's a bust, sometimes it's called a herm of Thucydides, and now I'm blanking on the other. I think it's Herodotus and Thucydides, back to back, as you can see. And this was originally the image I wanted for the book. I couldn't get the rights to it. And the reason I wanted it, though, was, unfortunately, but it's because I wanted to give a visual symbol of what I'm trying to say in the book, which is that there's a certain synergy among people who were literate enough and elite enough, culturally elite enough in the ancient world to write anything, really, that was sort of narrative prose in any kind of complicated way. And so I thought, because these two were historians, or what we might call historians, more or less, that showing them back to back, imagined together in some kind of network, some kind of literary network, was a nice visual for what I was trying to convey about the gospel writers. But again, couldn't get the rights, so ended up with this cover instead, which I actually have come to prefer, because I think that there's a lot of symbolism in this image that wasn't coming across in the other one. But here you have three of the gospel authors, the synoptic gospels, so Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And I like how they're kind of high-fiving each other. And also in an era of social distancing, they've got that going on too. So I ended up really liking this cover for that reason. But I also wanted to bring up that the title, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, wasn't actually the original title I wanted. And I had wanted the title, and the manuscript I submitted to the press said The Beginnings of Early Christian Literature. And so that's a theme we might come back to in the Q&A, and a theme for this whole talk, which is this obsession with origins that happens in the field of New Testament and early Christian studies with some regularity. You see it in scholarship, you see it in the kinds of discourses we have, the conversations among scholars, and even the kind of conversations that scholars have with the public. It always seems to be about what are the origins, as if there is an origin point for early Christianity, or that we can get at what we call these early Christians, or this earliest stage of the Jesus movement. To some extent, there are ways that we can access some of that information, but it seems almost like an obsession with the field to always come after this idea of origins. And what the consequence is of this kind of endeavor is that the only thing we really have from the first century, as far as we know, are texts like the letters of Paul or the Synoptic Gospels. And so we put a lot of weight on those sources to tell us a lot about, again, origins, because we're interested in it, but it might be more weight than those kinds of texts can bear. And that was one of the premises that I brought to this whole project. So thinking about who can write and also why are we obsessed with origins are really kind of the two focal points that I can point out at this stage for framing what came after. So today I thought I would talk mostly about the first two chapters, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff that comes after. But again, anything in Q&A we want to talk about is totally fine. But the first two chapters will really give you a roadmap for what the book tries to accomplish. So as you can see here, the first chapter is called The Myth of Christian Origins. So no surprise, the title based on what I just said. And what the chapter does is really go through some of the assumptions that the field tends to make about, again, what we can get at in terms of an origin for Christianity, and consequently what that kind of methodology or that approach does in terms of producing certain kinds of expectations or assumptions about the social formations that bring about the kind of literature that we see in something like the Gospels. And also really tends to be a definitive set of markers for how we even imagine the evolution of early Christianity to have taken place. And so I wanted to scrutinize all that, to trouble it, to see if it bears, if it can bear up against what we do as historians with any other kind of ancient literature from the first century.
It might be cool, even if and I'm not saying I'm going to interrupt the presentation. I just think it's cool to jab things I think are interesting you bring up in the book. And it might help you along the way with your limited coffee inside. So what I'll do is just throw the ideas out there, see what you think. One of the things you said in your book that I found fascinating in what you're saying here is we put too much weight sometimes on these ideas of social, this gospel's to this community, and this particular community, here's this leader of this community probably, or someone who's a literate person in it to read this among these potentially illiterate
spokesperson.
Right. Yeah. It's just, there's a lot there that you're pointing out. Maybe we start off wrong on this approach. Yeah.
I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Actually, let me jump ahead. Yeah. So I've written on this because I've described what were this idea of this sort of spontaneous social formation that Christianity fosters among these earliest followers as a Big Bang. Now, I'm not the first person to say Big Bang. There have been other scholars that have referenced it, but I love that imagery of, if you're thinking about origins too, that there's a focal point and then just an explosion. And if you read something like Acts of the Apostles, that's the narrative that you get. X number of people converted in one day by just listening to some of the teachings of the disciples or the apostles, right? That's supposed to be enough or sufficient to create some kind of spontaneous conversion experience. And conversion in this case being like a wholesale turning of your life. So you imagine some of these people who are supposed to convert being quote unquote pagans who hear this message and then just stop doing whatever they were doing in their day-to-day lives, worshiping the gods, break all those familial bonds to just become a Christian because it's just patently obvious that this is the thing that they should be doing with their lives. That's rhetorically the message you get in these narratives. Practically speaking, that's almost never the case. Conversion is a lot messier. It's often not spontaneous. It's often not that widespread. And so there's, back to this idea of certain work, there's work that these texts are doing and presenting even the concept of conversion in that particular way, or the idea that Christianity spread so rapidly, so cohesively, and so multiply, the way that it does from these, what's supposed to be like this origin point of the historical Jesus. And consequently, when we think about the Gospels, here's a little timeline that I like to show in my classes to contextualize this. What you have is Jesus dies sometime around 30. You have this man, Saul, who converts, becomes Paul, and starts talking to various groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about those groups in a second, about his experiences of the risen Christ. Now, to be clear, Paul never knew Jesus. He never met him. What he's describing is that he has these visions of the risen Christ, who is giving him certain information that he's then disseminating to the people that he's writing to. He has this, what we might call ministry, between about 50 and 60. His letters, which often get lost, especially in English translation, are very much in line with what we see from other Jewish writers of the first century who have been trained and educated in what we might call Greek paideia, which is basically just school, the kind of schooling that was sufficient to learn to read and write. There are other scholars, or ancient scholars, like Philo and Josephus, who have had the same thing, and they have in common with Paul that they often interpret scripture in terms of the popular philosophy of the first century. Sometimes it's called Middle Platonism, but basically it's a mix of Platonism and Stoicism. So a lot of the stuff that we even read in the Gospels and Paul, again, get lost in translation today. But when he uses words like spirit, the word pneuma in Greek actually means it's like a physical substance, and it has physical properties in Stoicism. And when you understand what he means by participation in Christ in terms of that, it makes a lot more sense than just the spirit. But after 2,000 years of using the word spirit, it makes sense to contemporary Christians without that background. But that kind of thing is going on in these texts that is often lost. Paul dies sometime around 60, 65, we're not sure. And sometime after the Jewish war, after the temple falls, that's when you first get the Gospels being written. And to your point, often imagined to be representative of the oral traditions of groups of Christians, the kind of groups that we imagine maybe Paul was writing to. But they're imagined to be illiterate, imagined to be kind of just like this rabble of people huddled together who tried to find some kind of literate spokesperson to represent that oral tradition for them. And then consequently, scholars will say, well, this spokesman must have written down the oral traditions. Those people selected stories that were important to them, those groups, those churches. And so maybe we can mine these texts to find out about the origins of Christianity by looking for the unique elements of each text, because that must represent the people who were asking for it to be written down. So an interesting kind of structure. I'm going to skip talking more about Paul for now, but oral tradition, which is the theory I basically just explained, does a lot of work for early Christianity to try to get us from that origin point to that point after the war that I just described, when we know these texts were being written. And there are reasons we can talk more. I'm sure you've talked to other guests about why we know that, including descriptions of the destruction of the temple that appear in like Mark 13. So it just seems pretty clear that the temple is already gone for various reasons by the time the Gospels are written. But to traverse that space and time, I mean, the earliest evidence you have for Christianity, for these origins, are the letters of a man who never met the historical Jesus. Then you don't have any stories about the historical Jesus until Jesus dies in 30 till 40 years later, at a time when life expectancy is about 24 years old. That's a long space of time. So how do you get from historical Jesus to the Gospels 40 years later? One theory that scholars have put forward over the years is the idea of oral tradition. So again, there are these stories that come either from disciples or the apostles, the early, leading figures of this movement after Jesus' death. They've passed on the teachings of Jesus. Those were passed down orally among these people, these collective groups who held on to it preciously over the generations. And then finally, they found a literate spokesperson to write them down. So that's basically the formula. Jesus teaches, he dies, sometime later somebody writes it down. Now, I have a lot of problems with this theory, and that comes across in the book. Among them, there are quite a few things, but one is that you have a problem. If you take the Gospels as describing the historical Jesus as in any way historical or accurate, what you have is a man who is teaching in Aramaic, who is teaching very locally, all things considered, to small groups relatively, and a small group of followers, and followers who are themselves illiterate. He chooses his followers among classes of people who would not have had paideia, fishermen, etc. So there is already there a big problem because the earliest Gospels are written in Greek, just for one example. So you have a translation problem right away. You have basically a game of telephone, too, because you have whatever he said spoken to a small group of people. Again, assuming that the Gospels are giving us an accurate picture, and then you're relying on multiple generations to tell that story accurately, because there's often debates, is this word for word what Jesus actually said that we find in the Gospels? And obviously it's not word for word, since the Gospels weren't written in Aramaic. So that question's already off the table, because by the time you have it written in Greek, you already have one active translation, right? So you have things lost in translation, possibly. So by the time these things are actually written, that's a lot to traverse in terms of the reliability of what we might call, again, origins of Christianity or the historical Jesus. So back to this idea that it's a lot of weight for it to bear. It's difficult to imagine that the literate spokesperson in the oral tradition framework is a really reliable one historically, just given everything else that we know contextually about historical development of texts and writing practices in antiquity. So to me, oral tradition doesn't make sense as a main driver for the kind of stories that you have in the Gospels. And by the way, the other problem you have is that often things that appear in the Gospels are things that Paul said. And again, Paul never met the guy. So it may be that there are other source materials, written source materials, that are being used by whoever is writing the Gospels, and that is the primary and most formative both material that these writers are using, but also the most formative social group in terms of helping determine what appears in the Gospels, meaning the literate community around someone with that kind of schooling and the knowledge to write something down, again, in antiquity, in Greek, in narrative form, not in verse. Often things in oral tradition are in verse. That's not what you have in the Gospels. Someone to have that kind of competency, the people who are probably determining the content of whatever they're writing are their fellow writers in terms of just primacy. Doesn't mean that these authors, they've learned about Jesus somewhere, don't know some Jesus adherents, might not themselves be part of what's called an ecclesia, a church, but that may not be the thing that is most informative for them when they're writing down the Gospels. So the problem also with the oral tradition theory is that I always like to use this example too in my classes. If Jesus dies around 30, Mark is our earliest gospel, written sometime around the Jewish War. It would be like us, depending on which gospel you're thinking about, writing about World War II or the Beatles or Elvis or the Bee Gees for the first time. And even that, I'm actually being kind of generous, because the joke, I'm a big Beatles fan. So the joke I always give is, I can pretty much recite any Beatles song, but it's in verse and it has meter, in a way like Homer did. That's not what you have in the canonical Gospels. Actually, I don't think in any gospel you don't have Jesus speaking in verse or something that might indicate some kind of oral tradition. So with all of that in mind, I wanted to ask, and this goes into the second chapter, why then does it seem that the study of early Christian texts is so idiosyncratic? Why this obsession with origins? Why the obsession with the idea of the spokesman writing for the community? Why the obsession with oral tradition? And why have we... I wasn't even just concerned about why are we stuck in a certain methodological pattern, but it was more like, where did this come from, right? Where in the academic study of these texts did this get authorized as an approach? Because I can see it from the perspective of reading the Gospels from a faith-based perspective. Of course, the earliest Christians weren't literate and needed a spokesperson because the Christians in the Gospels aren't literate. Well, you have to be taking the Gospels very literally in that case that they are giving a reliable history to then extrapolate from that by the time it's 70, like all of these Christians are still themselves, not literate, or maybe only one of them, in a big community is. I mean, even that framework to me seemed bizarre because it recognized how few people were literate to say that you needed the spokesperson, or maybe there's just one person in the community who has the ability to write these things down. That kind of gives it away that this was the purview of more of an elite class. So it just kind of didn't make sense to me. So when you get into a field and you become an academic, you have to do all kinds of research into the history of the field. You get all these general exams and tests on who wrote what, and you have to get up on all the theory and methodology. But at a certain point, it's a generational thing. Depending on your interest, you might go really into a deep dive. But generally speaking, you want to be like up to date on the newest kind of theory and literature. So you might only go back, like, say, 30 years, with the exception of like a couple of texts that are really formative for the field. I went back even further. I went back to the 18th and 19th century. And the reason I did that is that the field of New Testament itself, at some point, I came actually from a classics background. And even when I taught at Wheaton, I was the Greek professor. I wasn't really teaching religion. Unless you consider, I consider the ancient Mediterranean, I consider it all religion. Whether I'm teaching about the gods or teaching about Jesus or Judaism. But I was principally teaching, classics. And that was my background even going into this field. And there was a time, though, especially when the Academy first started doing a critical reading of early Christian texts, that the field wasn't divided. There weren't those disciplinary boundaries of classics and then religious studies over here. And when you go back to that period, and it's often the period is called the Romantic period, or referred to as Romanticism. So this is a period particularly for the field of religious studies in Germany that emerges in the 18th and 19th century. And what you have there are a bunch of scholars trying to read ancient texts, but doing so in all the ways that I just talked about, looking for origins, trying to find oral traditions and the like among a variety of different texts, often for nationalistic purposes or often for political purposes in their era. So especially in Germany in the 19th century. And some of the tenets of Romanticism really started to ring out to me as indicators of, okay, this may be why this methodology both seemed sensible in the Romantic period and why it persists. So Romanticism was characterized, and this is very broad, but characterized by a few concepts that scholars reading, and especially ancient texts, were looking for. Origins, particularly among German Romantics, there was an anxiety that, well, we have all these ancient Greek and Latin texts, but what was the original, like, Indo-Germanic language of the German people? Like, where's our identity as a people, especially politically at that time? Germany wasn't really a unified country the way it is today. It was a bunch of little statelets that eventually unified. And when that unification happened, they started wanting to look for evidence of their national heritage. And there was a lot of, again, anxiety that you had that evidence in a place like, Italy or Greece, but not in the same way in Germany. So a lot of concern with what are the national origins and stories of the German people. That was a very, very common question being brought to ancient texts. And again, by people who there weren't disciplinary boundaries. You could work on the New Testament and work on an ancient German text and then, work on Homer. And that was perfectly fine. And you would bring the same methodologies to each. There is also a concern in Romanticism with the folk, the people, and wanting to get at the stories and the language and the oral traditions of the people, especially if you're looking for evidence of the origins of a people, in this case, the Germanic people, who didn't really leave behind the kind of text that Homer did or Virgil did, right? So you're looking for some evidence of the oral traditions of the people. And there was increasingly a sense in this period that the stories of the common man were more important than the stories of, although the stories of the great writers and poets, they often use the term the poet or the author geniuses, were also important. There was also a deep concern with what are the stories of the people that they shared, because there was also a feeling that knowing what day-to-day people were telling each other in terms of oral stories might reveal more about national character than just looking at the things that like the great writers of a period were producing. The best example I can give of this, sort of ironically, is Shakespeare. And you would think that why are the Germans looking at Shakespeare? If they're looking for their national heritage, why are they going to England? But the thing that Shakespeare did was he was supposed to capture the stories of the like low-lived Elizabethan. You know, he was capturing the story of the common English person. And so as a model for what they're looking for, he was a poet and an author genius, but he also captured what they often use the term spirit, the Geist in German, this spirit, the national spirit of the common people. And so that was one big methodology that you saw across the board. And then the other was a concern for community. And that should be clear from everything I've said in terms of searching for nationalist roots for particular movements and peoples. So when those are your concerns within a political, academic, structural framework, and this also happens to be the cradle of the emergence of both, you know, the critical study of ancient texts, critical study of the Bible, and the field we now call religious studies, you can see the overlap between traditional methods in New Testament and what was going on in Romanticism. So essentially, I started to propose that while other fields like classics more or less abandoned these kinds of methodologies and terminology, you know, recognizing that origins is problematic, the word community is so politically loaded, especially in France as well, in the Romantic era. You know, these kinds of words tend to be scrutinized and understood to have their own context in English that's problematic, that we have a certain inheritance from it. It seemed as though, or like the concern with the oral tradition and not really critically engaging how oral tradition may be problematic, all of that seemed to be things that other fields had already contended with. But I wasn't seeing much evidence of that being addressed head on in New Testament. And another example, just briefly, to really sort of contextualize, other than Shakespeare, the kind of project that you often saw within German Romantic circles, the Brothers Grimm comes to mind. And this is, you know, two guys that everybody's probably heard of. I think there was some Matt Damon movie, right? At some point. So everybody's probably heard of the Grimm brothers, and, you know, they collected these Germanic fairy tales. Except their methods were really messed up. They weren't really collecting the oral traditions of a people. They were kind of filling in the blanks and talking to like one or two people. And they didn't really have the credentials, honestly. They had some schooling and they had a lot of interest and they had some money and they wrote really mean letters when you disagreed with them. And that combination sort of raised them within popularity during the 19th, you know, that German Romantic period. But, you know, as academics, but that whole, they sort of, they're emblematic of that entire interest. There are other scholars. There's this scholar whose last name is Kuhn, who was doing the same thing, but, you know, had the credentials, was doing it legitimately and interviewing common people to try to find out their oral stories. And he ended up writing a book that almost nobody read, that they really wholly dismissed. He's a German scholar. That said, you know what, when I ask people to tell me their myths, they just make them up on the spot. You know, wow. These myths, they evolve. He called it mythopoetics, basically, that they can be spontaneous and they might not be reliable. And everyone was like, no, right? The Grimm brothers method was better. It gave you those oral stories. And so then suddenly, you know, the terrain of Germany, you could